Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you to everybody here in the Mount Holyoke and 5 Colleges community. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here with all of you. I've found interacting with students in the various classes to be very rewarding. I particularly appreciate the presence of students from so many other countries around the world. That means that the discussion in the classes that I saw is really a very rich discussion, especially when we address international issues. Sometimes at American colleges and universities, we fall into a kind of American provincialism where we really don't have any idea how the rest of the world lives and therefore can get away with what would be considered outrageous arguments and viewpoints if we were ever confronted with somebody who is actually from somewhere else or some other reality. And I appreciate the fact that that doesn't take place here because there are so many students from so many different countries, that there's so many different perspectives, and I can see that the Mount Holyoke students are already, from my perception, conditioned away from American provincialism, surely because they've been interacting over every day with students from so many parts of the world. So I think it's really a wonderful thing that the university or the college has achieved by actively recruiting and making a priority for the educational experience to have people from around the world. Tonight I'm going to talk about the world food crisis, causes and solutions. Most of you may or may not be aware that since 2007 until now, there have been a series of enormous jumps in food prices in many countries around the world. It's less noticeable here in the United States because we spend a very relatively small proportion of our income on food. So even when the price goes up dramatically, we don't feel it as much when we are only spending something like 12% of our income on food, as people do in other countries who in some places of the world may be spending 30%, 50%, or even 70% of their income on food. And so of course the food prices on the average double and you're spending 70% of your income on food, you're clearly going to feel that immediately because you're going to have to reduce your food intake. So while it may be experienced as a little bit of sticker shock in the supermarket in the United States for many people, although certainly for poorer Americans it may be a lot worse than that, in other parts of the world it's a more dramatic impact and has caused major problems of hunger and unrest in many countries in the world. Now I'm going to address the issue of the world food crisis, which has gotten a lot of media, a lot of press, a lot of academic and research analysis from a particular viewpoint, and I want to be transparent about my viewpoint. I am speaking from the perspective of this international movement, La Via Campesina, that was mentioned to you by Eva Paus, which is the global alliance of family farmer, peasant farmer, farm worker, landless peasant, indigenous people, rural women, and rural youth around the world. It's a movement considered by many to be the largest transnational social movement or popular movement anywhere in the world today. It's around the world. There are local organizations that are members of La Via Campesina in 69 countries, in the East and the West, in the North and the South. Probably somewhere between 300 and 500 million farm and peasant families belong to organizations that are part of La Via Campesina. Here in the United States, there are a number of national family farm organizations that are part of La Via Campesina, such as the National Family Farm Coalition, as well as several farm worker unions. Here in the US, the National Farmers Union of Canada, Union Paysanne, the Farmers Union of Quebec, and many farmers organizations from throughout Latin America, every country in Europe, most countries in Africa, and most countries of Asia, with a notable exception until now of China, although hopefully that will be remedied soon. So Via Campesina is a space in which family farmers, small farmers, come together from around the world and share their problems and their perspectives. It's something that's arisen only recently, only during the period of time of economic globalization. Because economic globalization based on free trade agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which links the United States, Canada, and Mexico, or like the World Trade Organization, which most countries of the world belong to, or like many regional and bilateral free trade agreements, have meant that farmers everywhere have been faced with their local markets being inundated with low quality, subsidized, cheap food coming from large food surplus agro-export countries like the United States and the European Union. What we do is called dumping. We dump our surplus food production into the economies of other countries, typically because of US government subsidies at a price that's below the cost of production. So that means if you're a farmer in Mexico, if you're a farmer in Ghana, if you're a farmer in India, and you have to face your local market filling up with American and European products, the same thing that you produce, but at a lower price than the price you can produce it for, then that drives you out of business. You cannot compete with something that is so cheap. Typically, for example, US corn or maize has arrived in the economies of other countries at a price that's 25% below the cost of production on the average. So this process of economic globalization and linking markets and allowing this kind of free trade, which is taken advantage of by giant trading corporations, agricultural trading corporations like Cargill or Archer Daniels Midland, has hurt farmers everywhere and has really accelerated the driving of people off the land, migration from rural areas to cities in many parts of the world, and meant that farmers who once thought maybe they were competitors, maybe farmers in Central America thought their competitors were American farmers, but once they started talking to American farmers and realizing that the same forces were driving down the prices that American family farmers get paid, to the point where 2/3 of American family farmers have gone bankrupt in this country. They're now less farmers than prisoners in the United States. Once they started talking to each other, they realized that the problems that they face, even if their standard of living was superficially quite different, but their problems that they face were the same, and they're on the verge of bankruptcy, whether they're in Central America, whether they're in the United States, whether they're in Europe or Africa or Japan or South Asia. And so they came together because these are forces that come from beyond national borders, and therefore they require, in addition to the local struggles that farmer organizations are always involved in, require struggle, joint struggle and resistance at the international level. And so that's why they formed in the early 90s La Via Campesina. What this slide is meant to demonstrate is the top row and the bottom row sort of reflect the two main areas of work of this global peasant and farmer coalition. The top is what we might call political mobilization, protest, pressure to change those policies that are hurting farmers everywhere, and often those same policies are hurting consumers and hurting the environment and hurting poor people in urban areas. So it's political mobilization, the work of social movements. The lower row refers to a kind of internal work inside farmer organizations, because one of the forces that's driving farmers off the land is the model of industrial agriculture that originated in the United States and has been exported around the world. And that means farming with expensive purchased inputs like chemical fertilizer, chemical insecticide, chemical fungicide, chemical herbicide, commercial purchased seeds, tractors, tractor parts, mechanical harvesters, irrigation equipment, electricity, petroleum, and so on and so forth. That's a process which has meant that farmers have lost control over their own productive process. They've lost their autonomy, and they now depend on external markets that supply them with inputs, and in those external markets, just in the last 5 years, prices have tripled around the world and made it very difficult for farmers to make a living with the increased price of fertilizer, the increased price of pesticide. And so that has spurred the organizations to look for ecological farming techniques, which is essentially retaking control over the productive process, rebuilding some kind of partial autonomy of the farm family over their own life and their own space and their own reality by cutting that dependence on external markets, at least on the input side, that have hurt farmers so much. So those are two big areas of work of La Via Campesina. Back to the food crisis now. As you can see in this chart of grain prices, in late 2007 and 2008, we had a dramatic spike in food prices. And this is the phenomenon that caused what you see higher up, which are different countries in the world that experienced food riots, protests of one kind or another, as well as governments taking drastic measures like banning the export of food from their economies during the crisis. People started to go hungry. Think about the percent increase in prices there, and then remember that there are places in the world where people are already spending 30 to 70% of their income on food. And imagine the food goes up with a price increase like that, it means people go hungry, and people were going hungry. And this caused a major crisis around the world. It caused governments to get very nervous in many countries because there's nothing like a good food riot in a capital city to make a government extremely nervous about its ability to stay in power. So a lot of concern has been generated around this phenomenon. And it's been one of the things that kind of bothers farmer organizations and peasant organizations is that the idea that there was a crisis in our food system when this happened was presented as though it were something new. All of a sudden, oh my God, we have a crisis in food and agriculture. But from the point of view of farmers and peasants, we've been in a state of crisis for 30, 40 years, and sometimes in a state of crisis since the Europeans conquered the countries that became their colonies and grabbed the best land away from land farming people. So crisis is nothing new for rural people. Crisis is a way of life. So there's some debate as to whether this world food crisis is really something new or perhaps just a new face of an old crisis. In any event, we had the prices going up, we had looting of stores, even fast food joints, governments, food companies all getting very nervous, and a lot of explanations, some more likely to be true than others, bandied about. We often hear this Malthusian argument that whenever there's a problem with food or wherever there's hungry people, it must be either because there are too many people or because we're not producing enough, or at least we're not producing enough for the number of people. So a lot of pundits jump to the explanation that food prices went up because we weren't producing enough food. However, what this data from the United Nations FAO shows is that from 1960 till the present, the amount of food produced per person, per capita, on the planet has been rising steadily. So in other words, in 2007 and 2008, when we had the food crisis, there was never more food available per person, per man, woman, and child than ever before in human history, per person. So there was no reason why many more people should suddenly be going hungry based on the amount of food that we were producing. So we have to clearly seek some other explanation. The Malthusian argument that Malthus argued that food production would grow arithmetically and human population would grow geometrically, and there would be a rising gap between population and food that would cause mass famine and hunger, just simply hasn't been borne out by history. Mass famine and hunger has, but we've got to seek the causes in different phenomena. So from the point of view of farmer organizations, if we look back, at least not that far back, but to the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, before the crisis of high food prices, the rural world was already in crisis. Farmers were already leaving the land in droves throughout the world. And in part, at that time, the face of the crisis was low prices. So one question is, could the same underlying causes have generated low prices for many years and then suddenly generate high prices? What were the causes of this long-standing crisis of farmers and peasants and indigenous people under neoliberal globalization? There are a series of forces that have been unleashed, and policy-driven forces, human-created forces that have been unleashed in the global economy that have undercut the ability of farmers to make a living, farmers everywhere. One of those that I already mentioned is free trade, which allows the subsidized, poor quality junk food, corporate food produced in surplus to be dumped in the economies of other countries and drive farmers out of business. This is also, as I said, called dumping, and it depends on export subsidies in large agro-export parts of the world like the United States, Canada, and the EU, or European Union. Another force that's squeezing farmers like crazy are the monopolies or oligopolies of transnational corporations over the markets where they sell their produce, their harvest, and the markets where they buy their inputs. So increasingly, there are increasingly fewer pesticide companies, fertilizer companies, seed companies selling those inputs to farmers, and as there's less competition, the price goes up for what farmers have to pay, essentially their production cost. And there are increasingly fewer companies that buy the harvest of farmers. There are just a handful of giant trading corporations that control 70 to 80% of the global markets in all of the major food commodities, like corn, like wheat, like soybeans, like rice. And as there are fewer and fewer companies, then they have the negotiating power. Farmers don't have the negotiating power because there's only one or two buyers. The buyers set the price, and farmers get a lower and lower price for what they produce. At the same time as the same monopoly power means that consumers pay a higher and higher price, ironically. The raw material in food produced by farmers is cheaper and cheaper, but what consumers pay is more and more expensive. That's the result of monopolies or oligopolies. As farmers are forced to leave the land, agribusiness takes over their land, so we have a process of land concentration, growing landlessness, and near landlessness. There's a wave of promotion of dependent, expensive, and destructive technologies, advertising campaigns, government extension services that push more chemical fertilizer, more chemical pesticide, GMO seeds, hybrid seeds, all of which get farmers deeper and deeper into the debt trap because those production costs are incurred debt for farm families that then they can't pay off as harvest prices drop lower. Policy biases. In country after country after country, the levers of public policy have been hijacked by agribusiness so that subsidies and government budgets that used to support family farm and peasant agriculture producing food have been redirected towards agribusiness companies controlled by elites that produce exports for other countries and don't produce food for local populations. And for peasant agriculture, we've gone down to near zero public budgets when 40 or 50 years ago, most governments had significant public budgets. And finally, if that wasn't enough, the privatization of almost everything that you need to make a living as a farmer. Most countries had some kind of public service that helped farmers bring their product to market, some kind of marketing board, some kind of parastatal, semi-public enterprise that guaranteed farmers a minimum price, guaranteed help for transporting their products. Almost all of those companies and enterprises around the world have been privatized, have been sold off from the public sector and sold to the private sector, and by and large have been acquired by these giant agricultural trading companies at a global level like Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland. The privatization of credit. Most governments in the world used to have rural development banks that gave family farmers and peasant farmers who produced food a break on interest rates. They gave them below market interest rates so that they could produce food for national populations. Those banks have been privatized. Now there are pretty much only private banks left in rural areas. And private banks have almost no interest in lending money to small farmers. They prefer to lend a big amount of money to a small number of borrowers rather than a small amount of money to a large number of borrowers. It cuts their paperwork, their red tape. They demand that farmers present land titles. Most poor farmers don't have a land title. They demand that they present a business plan. Most of them have no idea what a business plan is. I'm not even sure I know what a business plan is. And essentially, they're no longer subjects of credit. And so credit has vanished, essentially, because of privatization. Now the World Bank is pushing policies to privatize public land, privatize communal land, put it in the market, allow agribusinesses to buy it up. Water is being privatized. Seeds are being privatized and patented. You name it, it's being privatized. And while they claim that the private sector might be more efficient, there's one problem. If it's a private service, you have to pay to play. If you don't have any money, you have no access to that service. When something is a public service available to everybody, then poor people have access to it. So essentially, all of these services have been placed beyond the reach of poor farmers. And so they no longer have or before the recent crisis, they no longer had a decent price. They no longer had a way to get their product to market. They no longer had credit to produce it with. Everything basically has been progressively put out of their reach. And so essentially, from the point of view of La Via Campesina and farmer and peasant organizations, the model isn't working, and the model wasn't working long before this crisis, this more recent crisis in prices. I want to give you an example here of Mexico. I live in southern Mexico, and this is what happened with the price of corn. Almost all farmers in Mexico grow corn. Corn was domesticated by Mexican indigenous and small farmers over the last 9,000 years. It's the basis of Mexican culture, of the Mexican diet. Every farmer produces corn, and from 1982 to 1988, the price that farmers got on the average for their corn in Mexico dropped by about 50%. And since then, until 2010, it's dropped by another 50%. So in other words, corrected for inflation, small farmers in Mexico now earn 1/4 of what they earned in 1982. And nobody claimed that peasant farmers in Mexico were well off in 1982. People already commented on the extreme poverty in rural areas. So from extreme poverty to earning 1/4 as much, that has been the impact of economic globalization on small farmers. And that's why many Mexican small farmers now live in the United States, because you can't make a living in rural Mexico anymore. And that's the result of dumping and free trade policies. Now, we would hear a lot of government specialists, World Bank economists, and others tell us that this is not necessarily a bad thing, because this decline in the price of corn should mean that poor consumers in Mexico who don't produce their own food should be able to get a more affordable access to tortillas, which are made from corn and are the basis of the Mexican diet. So maybe some poor people would lose because they'd be farmers and couldn't make a living anymore, but other poor people in urban areas would gain because food would be cheaper. Unfortunately, over a lot of the same time period, the price that urban Mexicans pay for their tortilla based on corn, instead of going down as corn prices went down, went up 600 or 700% over the same time period. So there was no benefit for farmers, and there was no benefit for consumers. It turns out to be I guess a lie is the word to use, that somehow by squeezing farmers we're going to create a benefit for consumers or for the urban poor. Lest anybody think this only takes place in Mexico, this is what the situation looks like in the United States, where from 1970 to 2000, you can see a steady increase in what consumers pay for food and a steady decrease in what farmers get paid. What that means is somebody's making a killing, and it's not farmers and it's not consumers. And what it also means is that farmers could earn a lot more without necessarily having to make consumers pay more for food. Of course, then we'd have to get at the middleman, who tends to be a very large corporation these days. But this is a result of the corporate control over our food system, where the farmers are getting squeezed and the consumers are getting squeezed. And if we just look at it for a moment from the consumer point of view rather than the farmer point of view, we ought to ask, what are we getting for this higher price? Are we getting higher quality food? And of course, corporate food tends to be based on the essential food groups: salt, sugar, starch, fat, artificial color, artificial flavor, and various carcinogenic residues of pesticides. That's essentially what you're eating when you eat corporate food, and you pay more for it. What are the main causes of death and disease. Premature death in the United States, I mean, that's death before normal old age at a younger age. The major causes are related to obesity, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, colon disease, because there's no fiber in corporate food. Almost all of the patterns now of illness and mortality in countries like the United States are attributable to our food system. Corporate food is killing us. Corporate food is killing us. And it's not only killing us, but we're exporting that pattern of consumption to other countries. Where I live in Mexico, Mexico in the last 10 years rose to being in the top 10 of the most obese countries in the world. It now occupies the second place in the world after the United States. And the Mexican Health Service did a north-south transect in which they measured from southern Mexico, where I live in Chiapas, all the way to northern Mexico at the US border, the proportion of the population that's clinically obese. And it turns out that the proportion rises linearly. The closer you get to the United States border, the larger the proportion of the population that's obese. Not only that, but Mexico has a national epidemic of diabetes, of adult onset diabetes. 63% of the Mexican adult population has adult onset diabetes. It was unheard of 30 years ago. And that's also rises monotonically and linearly as you get closer to the US border. And that's the spillover effect of US food consumption patterns. So corporate food is not only killing people in the US, but it's starting to kill people in other countries as well. We are globalizing the American way of life and the American way of death through the American way of eating, which means stripping food of all of its flavor, of all of its cultural value, homogenizing diets, erasing culinary and gastronomic traditions of different cultures, and everybody in the end should eat McDonald's or Burger King. We have a phenomenon where producer prices, what farmers get paid, are volatile. They tend to fluctuate up and down. But consumer prices are sticky. Now what does that mean? Every time the price that farmers get paid, say for corn or wheat, goes up, food processors immediately jack up the price we pay for bread or any product that's made out of those things. But then when the price of corn or wheat drops back down, do they reduce the price of bread or something else after that? No, miraculously, the price sticks at that higher level until it gets ratcheted up again and ratcheted up again. So we have volatile prices for farmers and we have sticky prices for consumers. In Spanish, there's a song that roughly translated into English says, I don't know what's going on, something has happened to the law of gravity because everything goes up and nothing comes down. And it's talking about the consumer prices. Farmer prices, what goes up must come down, but consumer prices, what goes up stays up. In Mexico, according to the World Bank, this process has caused 6.2 million peasants to be driven out of rural areas in Mexico during the years that NAFTA has been in effect, since 1994. The Mexican countryside lost 1/4 of its inhabitants in just one decade. 1/4 of its inhabitants in one decade. Not just Mexico. In Brazil, when the US model of industrial agriculture, the Green Revolution, was exported to Brazil in the 60s and 70s, well, this says almost 30 million people, but other estimates make it as high as 50 million people over the course of 2 to 3 decades were driven out of rural areas in Brazil. And some 200,000 families are losing their land every day in Brazil. This is a phenomenon around the world. In the United States, at the end of World War II, we had 6.2 million farm families. Today we have 1.9 million. So we've lost 2/3 of the farmers in the United States. If you average that out, it's about 4,000 farmers going bankrupt every week for 45 years in the United States. In the European Union, it's almost as bad. It's about 2,000 a week. So that's the origin of the model. The origin of the model is the United States and the European Union. It's destroying farmers, it's destroying consumers, it's making people sick, and now we're exporting it to the rest of the world as well. So this is farmer protest. This is in Mexico. We shouldn't be surprised when there are rural uprisings and indigenous people put on ski masks and get AK-47s. People march against the free trade area of the Americas, free trade agreements, WTO. Farmers have been facing an unprecedented crisis since neoliberal globalization, economic globalization began. Now, in La Via Campesina, as a space of encounter of farmer organizations from the South and the North, people felt you couldn't just be against something, you have to be for something. And so farmers met and developed an alternative paradigm, a different way that the food system could be organized, a way that could benefit both farmers and consumers. And they call that food sovereignty. And food sovereignty basically means that the farmers in a given country should feed the people in that same country. And we shouldn't allow foreign corporations to steal those national markets away from local farmers. Those markets should be protected for local farmers. There should be land reform to put land into the hands of small farmers. That every country should be able to have its own agricultural policy. There shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all imposed by the World Trade Organization on every country. And we should have ecological farming practices that produce healthy local food for people instead of global unhealthy corporate food. So this idea of food sovereignty was the alternative formulated by La Via Campesina, farmers in the North, South, East, and West, to this long-term crisis, which was largely marked by low prices. It was a response to the crisis people are facing everywhere, and also about local economic development and national economic development, because when people buy their food from distant economies, the money ends up in the bank accounts of global corporations or maybe Wall Street, but doesn't circulate in the local economy and doesn't generate local economic development. But when people in a town, for example, buy their food from local farmers, then the local farmers get that income and they spend it in the shops and the local industry in the town. Capital circulates locally, doesn't get siphoned off to a faraway bank account, and actually generates more local economic development. Members of Via Campesina feel very strongly that as peasants and family farmers, we want to, can feed the populations of our countries. Just give us a chance. Just give us a chance. Just stop taking the markets away and destroying them with corporate food and privatizing the credit. There's an enormous underutilized productive potential in peasant agriculture. Most able-bodied people have been forced to migrate out of rural areas, but we have many cases now where any small policy change and people return because they're not doing well in urban slums and they miss their rural livelihood. Don't farmers benefit from high prices? When the prices went up and Via Campesina expressed concern about the high prices that during the price crisis in 2007 and 2008, people were like, what are you complaining about? First you were complaining for 30 years about low prices for your crops. Now there's high prices and now you're complaining again. What's wrong with you people? In fact, however, and perhaps this shouldn't surprise people, when the prices went way up, by and large farmers didn't benefit from them. This is an example from 2007 of what happened to corn farmers in the United States when corn prices spiked. The interesting thing, and this is different months during the year, it's just an example, but this example is repeated around the world. The particularities of this example are that then President Bush announced a major initiative to promote biofuels, which Via Campesina calls agrofuels. And that means massive subsidies to corporations like ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, to create ethanol plants, to buy corn and turn it into a substitute for gasoline for cars. So instead of using corn to feed people or to feed cows to feed people, it would be used to feed automobiles. So there was a lot of publicity. Ethanol, there's suddenly going to be a market for all this corn that American farmers couldn't sell, and there was like biofuel fever, and the price was driven very high of corn in the U.S. Now, U.S. farmers have a thing called futures. It's almost like a gambling thing. You can sell your corn when you harvest it and actually have it harvested, but you can also sell it during the growing season at a future price. So you can decide any day during the growing season, I'm selling my corn today at what the price is today, at what the price is predicted to be today, and I'll get that price at the end of the year when I harvest it. So farmers always have to be judging if prices are going up or prices are going down. So what happened to American farmers in 2007, the price spiked because of the publicity from the Bush administration about biofuels, and everybody, TV news, Fox News, everything was saying corn prices are going to keep rising, keep rising, keep rising. So almost nobody sold their corn when the price was high. And then they discovered that actually the Bush administration had oversold the capacity of ethanol plants, and they couldn't buy any more corn. They were saturated. There was going to be a huge surplus that couldn't be sold, and prices immediately collapsed. And then everybody said to the farmers, you got to sell because prices are going to keep going down. So almost all the farmers sold when the prices went down. And then it turned out the overselling of the capacity wasn't as bad as was projected, and prices started to go up, but those who benefited from the prices now were the traders like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill, who had bought it at the lowest price and now were the ones who benefited from the price increase. So what I use this particular example to demonstrate is that in volatile price markets, the big players who can afford to gamble and bet are the winners, and the small players, i.e. family farmers, are almost always the losers. Bueno, so what were the causes of these higher prices? And here I want to make a footnote. After the prices went up in 2007 and 2008, they came back down. First of all, that was ironic because people told us we were now in a period in which prices would be permanently higher, but then they came down. And now, in fact, in 2010, they're going up again. So we didn't go from a period of low prices to a period of high prices. What we went to was from a period of low prices to a period of wildly fluctuating prices. And that shouldn't be surprising because we've just gone through 30 years of massive deregulation of the global economy and of national economies and eliminating any of the laws and controls on corporations that speculate with food. And so what we have now is a chaotic market. A chaotic market where the fluctuations, every time the price fluctuates up, it hammers consumers and poor people and hungry people, and every time it fluctuates down, it drives farmers off the land. Why is that happening? Well, we have the official story that we've heard from governments and the World Bank and the major news media, and they say, well, one of the main reasons prices went up in 2007 is that the Chinese people and the Indian people suddenly decided that they like to eat a lot of meat. And so they have now bought all of the corn and all of the soybeans in the global economy to feed their chickens and their pigs and their cows. And because there's too many people in China and too many people in India, the rest of us have to pay a high price for food. Turns out that's not true because during the whole food price crisis, both India and China were net exporters of cereals, not net importers. So there's no conceivable way that their purchases of animal feed could have been responsible for the price spikes. Some people blamed it on droughts and climate change, and while this is a problem that's going to be very severe in the future, it wasn't really the big enough problem to have caused the price rises in 2007 and 2008. So then we got the usual manipulations that we get from the powers that be, and they said, well, the problem is there's not enough free trade. We need more free trade. We need more WTO, more NAFTA, more free trade agreements, when in fact that was part of what had caused the problem in the first place of allowing these giant corporations to get control of the food system. Or it's that we're not using enough GMOs, not using enough chemical fertilizer, not using enough hybrid seeds. Essentially arguing that we weren't producing enough food, which clearly isn't true because we already saw that per capita food production was rising the whole time. So what are some of the real reasons? We've done a very in-depth study of the causes of the food price crisis in La Via Campesina, and one of the major things that happened was that financial investment funds discovered the food commodity futures market as a place to gamble with money. What happened was global financial capital was coming off the major downer of the collapse of the home mortgage market in the United States. They were desperately looking for a new place to park several $100 billion in speculative investments, and they discovered the commodity future exchange for wheat futures, rice futures, corn futures, and they started to place that money. What those graphs show are the increase in its speculative investment, At first, it seemed that there was $70 billion more placed into food futures in 2008 than ever before, but now it turned out it's $300 billion more. And that was short-term speculation. What they did was they inflated a speculative bubble. And yes, the law of gravity does apply to speculative bubbles, that what gets inflated up eventually collapses down. So what they were essentially doing was using the commodity market as a gambling casino where they could gamble, and what they were essentially gambling on was the food of everybody else. So speculation by financial capital was one of the short-term causes. I'd just like to point out, although I'm not a religious person, that it has been observed in the Bible and other great pieces of human literature, historical literature, that hoarding and speculation with food by the private sector and by private merchants has been with us as long as we've had a private sector and private merchants. Careful reading of the Bible will not say that they expelled Cargill and ADM from the temple, but other merchants who engaged in the same kind of behavior were expelled. And the first sign we had of the food crisis in 2007 was the tortilla crisis in Mexico. Tortillas, remember, are made from corn. It's the basis of the Mexican diet. In early 2007, the price of tortillas went up 300%. And this was immediately blamed by companies on the same biofuel fever in the United States. However, it later turned out that the international price of corn by that point in time had only gone up 30%. So why did the tortillas go up 300%? That's what people started to ask. What happened? What explains the other 270%? Well, it turns out that as the Mexican government privatized its infrastructure, they used to have a huge infrastructure that bought corn at a subsidized price from small farmers and stored it against famines and against food shortages. That had all been privatized, mostly to Cargill. And what Cargill had done was to buy almost the entire 2006 corn harvest in Mexico and withhold it from the market in their warehouses until an artificial shortage had been created. When an artificial shortage had been created and people were panicking and there were lines several hours long to buy tortillas, they then finally took their corn out of the warehouse, which they had hoarded to speculate on, just like biblical merchants, and put it on the market and ended up, on the average, selling it for twice as much as they had paid for it 6 months earlier. So, speculation, hoarding, and transnational corporations. We had the confluence in 2007 and 2008 of a speculative bubble created by financial capital, but that was made worse by the normal hoarding and speculation that the private sector and private corporations engage in all the time. So the price started to go up because of the speculative capital going into food. Once the price started going up, the food corporations, instead of putting the food on the market, they withdrew it from the market. What did that do to the price? It made it go up even higher. So they could wait till it doubled again before they put it back on the market and take their speculative profit. So we had two kinds of speculation, one by financial capital and the other by commercial trading corporations. Another problem that we have in recent years is agri-fuels. The amount of land being devoted in country after country, either in plans or in current production, to producing biomass for automobiles, either through ethanol or biodiesel, is alarming. This is the example of the Philippines. I don't have time to go into the details, but the short version is the Philippines has a rising crisis of a rice shortage and a rice price increase. And in the middle of this crisis, the Philippine government has signed concessions with foreign companies to devote half of the rice area to producing biofuel for automobiles in Europe instead of rice for people in the Philippines. A more recent example is this year, 2010. We're starting, as we saw the price starting to go up again in 2010, we have a new price spike starting, a new world food crisis is starting as we speak. World cereal stocks are down 57 million tons this year compared to last year. 72% of that drop occurred right here in the United States of America, and 61% of the drop in global food availability from last year to this year is completely due to the United States devoting a higher percentage of grain to making ethanol for biofuel for automobiles this year. So we've been given a lot of arguments about how biofuel is green and better for the environment. In fact, it's not green. In fact, it uses more petroleum to produce it than it's saved by using it. It's driving farmers off land, and it's causing, it's accelerating the food price crisis. We have the problem of the continual rise of inputs for agriculture, like chemical fertilizer and chemical pesticide. Really begs the question of how long can we afford to have a production model that links food prices to petroleum prices. That's one of the strong arguments for ecological farming, to break that dependency. So, in synthesis, the causes of the world food crisis, we have a long-term cause, which was the previous crisis, that crisis of 30 years, which essentially was the dismantling of the productive capacity to produce food by peasant and family farms, the ongoing previous crisis around the world. They lost credit, they lost land, they lost markets, they lost prices. They ended up migrating to Los Angeles, essentially. At the same time, all of those services were redirected towards producing exports and agrofuels, but not by peasant farmers, by commercial agribusiness farmers. Some very minor effect of changing consumption patterns. People deciding to eat more meat in different parts of the world did not cause the world food crisis. In the short term, we had the speculative capital, agrofuels, rising input costs, hoarding by the private sector, speculation by financial capital, and forced exports. Forced exports is really unbelievable, but in country after country, when foreign corporations control key food commodities, if they discover that there's a higher price, say, for cooking oil in another country, before you can turn around, they have exported all of the cooking oil out of your country and to the other country where there's a higher price, and suddenly you have to wait 5 hours online to buy cooking oil. This happened in Bolivia, this happened in Venezuela. Or suddenly you're in the middle of a rice crisis, but rice prices are even higher somewhere else and they've exported half your rice. This happened in Indonesia during the world food price crisis. And a problem that's just beginning, but that's going to get a heck of a lot worse soon, is the effect of climate on our ability, of climate change affecting our ability to produce food. So the new crisis is almost the same as the old crisis. We could say that the underlying cause has been too much corporate power over our food system. Policies that are bad for farmers, bad for consumers, bad for the environment. First, they drove farmers off the land. They made us dependent on corporate food. Once we were dependent on it, then they jacked up the prices. I mean, that's the simple, simplistic, oversimplified way to look at it, but it's not that far from the truth. Now, how would we address it? And this is the last item I'm going to talk about. It turns out that as we've analyzed the causes, as I've laid them out to you, it turns out that the old policy prescription of Via Campesina, which was food sovereignty, which we were prescribing for the low crop price crisis, turns out, with only slight modifications, is the best package of policies to address the high price or the volatile price or the speculative price crisis. We need to have policies at the national level in country after country to protect domestic food markets, both against dumping by transnationals, which is artificially low prices, and against artificially high prices from speculation. If for our food in any country we depend on the global economy, we're going to be whiplashed. When prices go up, consumers go hungry. When prices go down, farmers are driven off the land. And everything indicates prices are going to fluctuate more and more and more in the global economy. And that whiplash is really going to be destroying most countries in the world. We need to have the management of agricultural supplies like we used to have in the global economy before those mechanisms were all dismantled from the 1970s until now. We need to recover the productive capacity of peasants by giving them, like they used to have, guaranteed minimum prices, marketing boards, public sector budgets, real agrarian reform. We need to boost the productive capacity of peasants and family farms because the vocation of peasants and family farmers is producing food. That's what they do. That's their mission in life. The vocation of agribusiness is producing dollars, and if those dollars are more easily obtained exporting the food to another country or turning it into gasoline for automobiles, then they will do that. They have no commitment to food security or food sovereignty of anybody. We need to return food inventories to public hands. Almost every government in the world had public controlled food reserves like Mexico had as a hedge against shortages. When there's a shortage, the way the public sector behaves is to take food out and put it on the market at a low price so that people don't suffer price shocks in their food bill. But the way the private sector behaves, as we've seen, is the opposite. It withholds food from the market when there's a crisis and makes the crisis worse. One of the main underlying causes is the long-term switch in the world from public food stocks to private ones. So we need to renationalize food stocks and food inventories. We need effective government controls against hoarding, speculation, and forced export. We need to stop this craziness of agrofuels, of feeding cars instead of people. And we do need to technologically transform farming systems to not be dependent on petroleum. We need ecological farming in harmony with nature that produces healthy local food, culturally appropriate, not homogenized global corporate food for people everywhere in the world. Peasants and family farmers are able to do this, are willing to do this, want to do this, and want to build alliances with consumers, urban slum dwellers, environmental organizations, consumer groups, human rights organizations, trade unions, and others to change the food system and to build the kind of food system in which consumers, the urban poor, and farmers all can live a better life and escape from the corporate domination, the corporate unhealthy food, the corporate driving of farmers off the land that's happening everywhere at the same time. Thank you.